Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Blind Spot. This is another episode. Today, it's just Evan and I, and we are going to be talking about intelligence in all of its forms. So I just wanted to note I've been going back and listening to all my old Tom Waits albums. And I was wondering, Evan, since you hate Steely Dan so much, which makes me so sad.
No, I love Steely Dan. I don't hate Steely Dan.
You made fun of me for when I was talking about Steely Dan. You were like, Steely Dan.
No, not Steely Dan. It was probably something else. No, I love Steely Dan.
Oh, okay.
No, I always love Steely Dan. No.
You told me I have to listen to James Brown, which I'm like, yeah, I'll listen to James Brown.
Well, yeah, true. I mean, for sure, that's true. But no, but I love Steely Dan. Yeah.
What about Tom Waits? Because I'm going on a big Tom Waits jag now.
I appreciate Tom Waits. I was never really a big Tom Waits fan. My wife Rebecca is, my son Gareth is. They're really into Tom Waits. I would never say anything bad about Tom Waits, but I was never sort of taken up with really being into his music particularly. Yeah.
Now, you never were doing a deep dive.
Not really. Not really.
So,
I was kind of, Talking Heads, that was kind of, I was very into 80s music. Yeah. I mean, I was raised on 60s, 70s stuff, especially with my parents. Then when the 80s, music hit, I found that very liberating. I loved that. So yeah, Talking Heads and
a lot of synth. Yeah.
Yeah. Gang of Four, kind of like sort of punk, edgy, metally. Yeah, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, okay. That's good to know because I've always felt the whole Steely Dan thing. I was like,
no, I don't know where you got that impression.
Steely Dan?
No. I mean, Steely Dan was like the background music of my childhood in the 70s. I love that. Yeah. There was a lot of 70s music I didn't like, but I did like Steely Dan.
Yeah, and what angers me is the idea that Steely Dan is like, they call it yacht rock. It's this whole thing. We're not going to get into this.
No.
But I find it very offensive to see. I thought Steely Dan was so innovative. There's only been one Steely Dan. There'll never be another. Whereas what they call yacht rock, just because Michael McDonald appears on a Steely Dan album does not make it yacht rock.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think we can close that subject up.
Right.
So, Evan, you wrote a book called Mind and Life. Let's sort of begin there with the, what is intelligence and how is it connected to life?
Yeah. So, the idea of that book and of a whole, train of thought that's very much indebted to thinkers like Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela and Robert Rosen and, a whole variety of theoretical biologists is that, when we say what it is that makes something a living system, we have, in doing that, also specified the sense in which living beings are agents and the sense in which they are sense-making systems. And so the sort of really core root of the idea of intelligence from that perspective, or mind, if you want to put it that way, is the ability to make a world of sense or significance. That involves distinguishing things that are relevant versus things that are irrelevant. And that's fundamental to all living systems, all the way down to, the so-called simplest ones, bacteria, which are not simple at all, but, structurally are the smallest and the least differentiated structurally compared to, other multicellular organisms or eukaryotic cells with nuclei rather than prokaryotic cells like bacteria. But already when you have that kind of organization that involves producing and maintaining yourself as an individual, both dependent on but distinct from the environment in a selective way that singles out and differentiates things in the environment that are relevant to your continued existence versus things that are threatening, that don't really matter at all, that's sort of the fundamental move of relevance realization or sense making. And that is intelligence, because when we think about intelligence as, the ability to solve a problem, you can't really solve a problem in the sense of like a step-by-step procedure unless you already have some space of relevance. The problem as a step-by-step thing works within a larger setting of meaningfulness. And that's really what you get when you are this, agentic, self-producing kind of system.
Yeah, so let's unpack that a little bit, because I think for a lot of people, this is, these are kind of new ideas for most people. And it was for me, certainly, because when we think about intelligence and the endless discussions about artificial intelligence, it's always this idea of like, oh, intelligence is problem solving, like, some kind of rational. We think of intelligence as being about like formally solving a formal problem, like a mathematics problem.
Right.
But really what you're saying here is something entirely different. And so let's just unpack the idea of sense making and relevance realization. So let's just start with the idea, like, why did certain philosophers of biology, like Rosen and those guys and Monterella, pick out relevance realization? I'm not sure, maybe those are the wrong people to pick out, but what does it mean? Just like, in grandmother speak, what is relevance realization?
Right. So they didn't actually use that particular term. That actually comes from John Vervaeke's work.
Right.
But
that comes from somebody else's work.
Yeah, but he's glossing with that term in a nice creative way a lot of ideas that come from those thinkers. So Maturana actually, in a very foundational paper in 1970 called The Biology of Cognition, he posed two questions. He said, okay, so what from a biological perspective is really at the core of cognition? What is it that makes a system be a cognitive system? And then his other question was, what is it that makes a system be a living system? How does it have to be organized in order to be a living system? And then he had this sort of realization that the two questions actually had one and the same kind of answer, which is you need, and this is prior to the word autopoiesis, they haven't coined this word just yet. He says you need a kind of circular organization. So you need to be, as a system, organized in a way where there's what would later be called closure, where there's a cycle of operations that regenerates itself in a bounded, unified way. And when you have that, you not only have a kind of individuality and agency, but because this is in this is not an abstract thing, this is in a universe subject to, thermodynamics and all of that, you basically have a system that, in order to keep on going, has to in effect make predictions about its environment. It has to behave inductively, you could say. It has to, on the basis of what's happened to it up to that point, it has to in effect distinguish between things in the environment that are going to enable it to maintain its organization and things that are going to perturb it in a way that is deleterious or threatening. Prediction is a kind of like rudiment of sense making or cognition.
Right. So I think that's like I just want to, unpack this even more, like stop there because it's this idea that, like, to be alive, to stay alive, you have to know what matters and what doesn't matter. And the problem is there's an infinite amount of stuff out there, right? There's an infinite amount of, the world is infinitely resolvable, right? Into atoms and such. So how do you decide, that I can pay attention to and that I can just ignore? So that's the problem, right, of relevance. Some things are relevant and some things aren't. And you have to get there, that idea of how a living system organizes itself so that it can separate out the important things from the infinite number of unimportant things. Is sort of the question of relevance. There was also Daniel Dennett, the famous philosopher, who you were a postdoc with him, had this paper about that it sort of involved a robot and a bomb that was also trying to illustrate the idea of how does the system know what's relevant or not? Can you just give us the basic idea of that?
Yeah, so that was a paper in the context of a problem in AI called the frame problem, which is basically how do you frame cognition in such a way that you can distinguish what's relevant from what's irrelevant. And he has a nice series of examples to illustrate that I don't think I can reconstruct right off the top of my head, especially here at, it's about 7:40 in the morning here in Vancouver. But the idea is basically
for you.
Yeah. The idea is you can't really distinguish what's relevant from what's irrelevant by applying an algorithm, because the algorithm is just going to leave you computing what you in some sense already need to know, which is you need to be able to distinguish what's relevant to compute versus what's irrelevant. And the algorithm itself isn't going to give you that. So you need some kind of architecture, you could say, that structurally, in terms of your body as an embodied being, already parses the world in such a way that you have an environment, you have a milieu. And within that, some things are immediately relevant for your action, given the kind of body you have, the kind of, scale of space and time at which you exist. And then within that, depending on the kind of creature you are, you can engage in more specific directed forms of problem solving. So an example that I think we use in the book, and we may even get this from John Vervaeke, I can't remember now, is, you're a student and your task is to take good notes at a lecture. This is something I talk to my students about, at the very beginning of a class, how to take good philosophy notes. Well, to take good philosophy notes, you need to, in some sense, distinguish like what's relevant to write down and what's not relevant to write down. So if you just try to write down exactly what I'm saying when I'm lecturing, sort of verbatim, well, that's no good, because you're always going to be lagging behind. You're not going to be able to write down exactly everything that I'm saying. So you need to sort of pull out the things that are helpful to remember, and you need to distinguish the things that are important in, say, the structure of an argument or in a concept or in a line of thought, and you need to distinguish those from things that are not relevant. And there's no algorithm for doing that. There's no step-by-step procedure for doing that. You could say it's kind of common sense. You have to basically, inculcate yourself through practice in a kind of common sense shared understanding, for which there aren't any rules or methods. There are maybe some heuristics, some kind of guidelines that can help you. So I tell students, things like, don't try to write down all the words, try to pick out the ones that are being emphasized, things that make you think that, you'll follow up with, things that help you remember, that stand out for you. And the more you do that, the better you'll get at it, and things will eventually kind of click. So that's a kind of relevance realization, at a very high level. Obviously, you're a student, you're in a classroom, but you're able to do that because you're already swimming in this whole world of meaningfulness that is, language and action and so on. Right. So in the case of the bacterium, to go to the completely opposite, end, the bacterium is built in such a way already that quite complicated discriminations are possible, on the order of like 40 different species of molecules that can be behaved in relation to ones that are metabolizable as food, like sucrose, ones like heavy metals that are toxic or threatening. And bacteria are built in such a way that they can, through how they move and the kinds of molecules they have in their receptor membranes, they can basically sample changes in the rate of concentration of molecules or ingredients over time, and then reorient their swimming, to swim up gradient or to swim down gradient by basically tracking changes in the rate of concentration over time. And that's sort of built into the structure of how they work, having receptor molecules in membranes that then influence the behavior of the flagella that organize and make them swim in a directed way. And so the idea is that because of the body, let's call it the body, bacteria have a shape, they have a body. The body creates meaning or relevance or significance because of how it's put together.
Right. And it makes sense of the world. And in some sense, I think the thing that we were arguing in the book, and that our continued research, the work we're doing now, and we've got this big grant that we're sending to the Templeton Foundation, or that has already been sent to the Templeton Foundation, is the idea that like that is different from just assuming, oh, well, there's a world out there that is made up of molecules and atoms, and there's a pre-existing world, right? Now, of course, we're not saying there's not a pre-existing world, but what we are saying is that the world that living systems inhabit, that they have made sense out of, is different from the God's eye view. Whatever the God's eye view is God's view.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. As living systems always kind of both create the world and the world creates them at the same time. That is the fundamental shift I think that we're arguing for. You can't just assume that like bacteria, like the normal view, the view that we are pushing against is the idea that bacteria are just machines, right? There's just a bunch of mechanisms and they're just machines that have evolved in an environment. End of story. It's all mechanism. Where this view says, no, there's something much more interesting, mysterious, scientifically, accessible, but it's a very different story. It is the co-emergence of the world as a world of, this is a good molecule, that's a bad molecule, right? Which requires the receptor. If you don't have a receptor for a molecule, it's not even there. Like you don't even notice that it's there.
Right.
So, so that's not in your world. If you don't have a receptor for a molecule, it just bounces against the membrane, and it's not part of literally not part of your world.
Yeah, no, an analogy that or image that Francisco Varela used to use that I think is nice here is on a kind of representational way of thinking about the mind-world relation, that there's a world out there and there's a mind in here, and what connects them is that inside the mind there's a representation. That way of thinking is kind of like thinking the relationship between the organism and the environment is like, you parachute in behind enemy lines. It's like there's the world out there, and then you, like the organism, parachute in, and if your connections and map are good, you survive and you're able to do things. And if they're not, then too bad for you. But that's not the way it is at all, because the organism and the environment co-construct each other. It's not that you parachute in from the outside. So what counts as the environment depends entirely on the structure and functioning of the organism. And of course, the structure and functioning of the organism, emerges as a kind of like self-individuating system or process out of the environment. So you have this co-creation, this co-emergence, and that doesn't take the form of being parachuted in from outside. Exactly.
Yeah, it's kind of like the map, and because we always distinguish between this idea of the map and the terrain, right? What physics likes to think is, often it's in my field, is that like, this map that we have, the equations of mathematical physics, are the terrain. Like that's it. That you are actually, that's the whole idea of a theory of everything, right? If I had a theory of everything, string theory or something, then that basically would be a full account of everything possible in the universe. And in physics, you and I and Marcelo have been pointing out that no, the map is always different from the terrain, right? That you can't substitute one for the other. But even here, we're going even further. You're saying like we are constantly recreating the maps, right? We're creating the map as we go, and that and in some sense, the terrain that we live in, the actual terrain we live in, is also being co-created by the creation of the map. It's a collaboration between, whatever truly exists without us and us to create, but to co-create this environment self sort of duality.
Yeah, exactly.
Or
yeah,
unity,
one of the
actually, really, it's a unity in a way.
Yeah, no, that's right. So one of the examples we used way back in the day when we were writing The Embodied Mind, and then I did some work on subsequently, is in visual perception, color. So, of course, for there to be a world of color for us or for other organisms, you need light, you need surfaces, you need reflectance. So you need the things that you talk about in physical terms, using optics and physics. You need all that, but that's not sufficient to give you color. To give you color, you need an organism that has certain kinds of cells, certain kinds of photoreceptors, certain kinds of visual processing, and constructs in this interactive relational way with the environment, constructs color. Color, as Merleau-Ponty says, is the place where the brain and the universe meet. It's not in the universe, it's not in the brain, it's a relational thing. And different organisms have very different color worlds. The color world of a bird is a higher order in its dimensional complexity compared to the color vision of us or other primates. And that's because birds are sensitive to things like ultraviolet and polarization, and they have more complex retinas than we do. And they have different kinds of cells that engage in processing the retinal signals. And out of all of that, you have what emerges, which is the world of color. And we all, as mammals and other creatures, inhabit color worlds that are, unique to us, but that are in another sense shared, because they're all color worlds, even though they don't map one-to-one onto each other. So there's this, and you need a world for that. I mean, you need a world of, of light and photons, and you're not going to get it if you don't have that, of course. But it's an emergent, relational, interdependent phenomenon.
I want to stop for people, right? It's because that's what you said. So I really want I want to understand it myself. I want our listeners to understand it too. The idea that there's wavelengths. There's 400 nanometers or 750 nanometers, but that's not a color. That's a wavelength of electromagnetic radiation. That's not color. What you just said is that color, to live in a world in color, is an emergent phenomena, right? That requires both brains and world, But in this interaction, it's the interaction from which the world we live in, which is the only world we live in, not the God's eye view that physics, that we're told is that physics gives us. That is an emergent phenomena from the interactions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we were to talk in terms of wavelength or frequency or how surfaces reflect light, so what is called the surface spectral reflectance, which is basically the proportion at each wavelength that a given surface reflects, given its physical composition and structure. There's no one-to-one correspondence between wavelength or reflectance and perceived color. You can have the same surface spectral reflectance perceived as different. By color now, I mean hue, the quality of redness, greenness, blueness, yellowness, etc. You can have the same surface spectral reflectance be perceived as one hue in one context, another hue in another context, depending on the other things that are in the environment, depending on the perceiver that's looking at it. Is it you or I looking at it? Is it a bird looking at it? Is it a fish looking at it? So the color does not map one-to-one onto the surface spectral reflectance. And the move that the physicist makes, we talk about this in the blind spot sometimes, some physicists, is to say, oh, well, color is just an illusion. It's just a perceptual illusion. There's really no color out there in the world. But the problem with that way of looking at things, so this is what Whitehead called the bifurcation of nature, is that no, actually color is in the world. It's just you're not looking at the world at the right level. It's in the world of life. It's in the world of biology. Color is hugely important as a biological signal, for example. The colors of plants co-evolved with the visual capacities of the bees and the birds who are able to see them. So the color is part of nature. It's just you're not going to find it if you look at it in just through the lenses of physics. You have to bring life into the picture. And so color is a kind of perceptual sense making. It's a kind of perceptual meaning.
And that move that those people that if you're those who are inclined that way, people, the branch of physicists and philosophers who call themselves realists, right, which I think is a huge misnomer, requires that assumption that this perspectiveless perspective, right, the view from nowhere, as philosopher Nagel said, that's a thing, that you can have this perspective, this view of the world without you in it. And that, I think one of the things we've been arguing is that's a fantasy. It's a useful fantasy. It can be very useful for doing certain kinds of things. So it's not bad. But when you think that's what's actually real, then that's where you run. That's what Husserl called the surreptitious substitution. You're substituting what is a method for actual reality. And the only perspective we get, the only perspective any human being has ever had is our perspective. So sort of talking about mythical, sort of perfect objective perspectives is like invoking some kind of religious, that's something that's supernatural in the sense, because we are nature. We are nature, part of nature too, and that's where we have to begin.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think, the view from nowhere is a kind of intellectual, very powerful intellectual extrapolation that's useful for certain intellectual discursive purposes. But when you confuse it for a statement about being, then you run into exactly what Husserl called the surreptitious substitution. You substitute a method or a procedure of thought for a statement about how things are, and that that's a fundamental mistake. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so then I think the interesting thing here, and I want people to understand also, we're not rejecting science here. How could we? We're science and philosophers of science, but what we're saying is there's a different way to think about science, and when you think about, and there's really, most importantly, there's a different way to think about nature. And when you think about nature differently, new scientific questions arise that haven't been considered before and that have really profound implications. So, and you will reach those by doing science. The methodology of science never changes, right? It's the inquiry, empirical based inquiry. It's just the frame that you think that you're doing it in. And, I think kind of our argument, and this is where, like with intelligence, especially this comes very relevant for artificial intelligence, where you can see that the old frame, that objective frame, sort of is going to lead you to dangerous places, and it's going to lead you also into a sort of a dead end. So let's just talk a little bit about that now, right? So we've introduced the idea of sense making, of having to be in a world already, and that even bacteria have this kind of intelligence. So, with what's happening with AI now, what do you see as the sort of difficulties or problems with the way we're framing AI, especially the AI that's being shoved down our throats by billionaires?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of different forms or types of AI over the history of AI, and it's obviously an evolving field. But what most people think of when they think of AI today is the deep learning networks. So things like large language models. And these are basically, from my perspective and the perspective of the view of life, mind and life that we were talking about before, these are not sense-making agents at all, for a number of reasons. But the main one is that what they are incredibly powerful statistical prediction machines. So they have an inordinately, high number of parameters, such a high number that, we can't, kind of directly, kind of hold it all in mind and track it, So that's when people say, oh, we don't really know what they're doing. That's actually not really true. We do know what they're doing because we built them and we know what their architecture is and we know the kind of computations and algorithms that they perform. It's just that the number of parameters are so huge that we can't follow all of the statistical pattern matching that's being done. But basically what these systems do is they say, in the case of something like ChatGPT, is that they predict on the basis of the data available to them and their algorithms the next most likely token in a series of tokens. And it isn't even really correct to say they predict the next most likely word, because the system itself doesn't know anything about words. It predicts the next most likely token that's being computed in a numerical way. And we recognize these tokens from the outside as words, and we recognize that they're strung together in a way that matches the patterns of text or conversation. But the system itself has no access to anything like that. It has no semantics. It's a powerful, formal statistical prediction device, and all the meaning resides in us, in how we relate what's being outputted to things that we already know, because we are, autonomous linguistic creatures. So another way to say it is, or another thing to emphasize, is that these systems don't have anything like what a bacterium has, which is a self-producing, self-generating, physically self-maintaining architecture, no body, no embodiment. They're virtual entities existing in an abstract computational universe that requires a lot of physical resources, and they're doing statistical pattern matching without any understanding of what it is that they're matching with the patterns that they match.
Yeah, there's nobody in there. Like the idea when people talk about, well, the AI knows. The AI doesn't know anything because there's no agent, right? Exactly. There's no sense-making agent in there. I just wanted to note one thing that for our readers, I read a book recently, Why Machines Learn, The Elegant Math Behind AI by Anil Anaswamy, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Right.
Great book. I mean, it requires, you have to have some, a little bit of calculus, a little bit of
algebra,
algebra, but also linear algebra.
Right.
But it's an incredible book for teaching you, sort of like running through, like, oh, exactly. It's brilliant. These things are brilliant. I'm not dissing LLMs. They're an absolute triumph of nature, and I use them all the time. But this idea that we're sold that, these are going to be the way that, artificial general intelligence, that a super mind is born, I think is ridiculous, because there's nothing. These things have nothing like a mind. There's no mind. There's no possibility of mind, given what we're talking about. I forget who it was. It was a guy who was a statistician or a probability theorist in the 50s who taught, maybe he was a computer scientist, who talked about small worlds and large worlds.
Oh yeah. Yes. I'm forgetting the name. I know who you mean, though. Right. So the idea being that these systems actually live in small worlds.
Right.
Rather
small
than,
world is where things are all defined. The inputs and the outputs are all defined.
Everything's
and this goes
defined.
back to relevance realization. In a small world, which is where every algorithm ever written lives in a small world, because there's just inputs and outputs. Relevance, there's still no relevance, but inputs and outputs are always defined, whereas all of life lives in a large world, right? The idea that there is far more going on. In some sense, there's an infinite number of things going on. There's infinite number of directions to look at, infinite number of things to look at in terms of infinite resolution. So it's like
and things are ambiguous. The thing about a large world is things are ambiguous, so there's there's multiple meanings, and figuring out which meaning is the relevant one is
for the relevant context, right?
For the relevant context, exactly. Right. No, that's right. Whereas in a small world, things are well defined, things are labeled, and the large language models in that sense exist in small worlds, even though they have an inordinately high number of parameters in their functioning. That's not large in the relevant sense of large.
So let's just unpack this a little bit more, because this is the hype that goes along with these, right? I mean, the amount of money and resources pouring into these things, because there's the expectation that these things are going to produce mind-like, independent, agential systems, is huge. And whether this is a bubble or not, this is I think all of our retirement funds are going to, if it's realized that, these things aren't what we said they were going to be. But go ahead.
I think I could be wrong about this for sure, but my impression is that, most of what's being poured into, the money that's being poured into creating and working with these things is not driven by a cognitive science agenda of wanting to understand the nature of intelligence. It's driven by industry, and it's driven by technological applications. And there's a lot of hype around the technological accomplishments telling us things about the mind, but that, I think, is really hype. I don't think that they tell us much about the mind at all. And the idea that there are paths to artificial general intelligence, that just seems to me to be hype. The very idea of artificial general intelligence is itself a big question.
Right.
So there's different ways of criticizing it. One way to criticize it is to say it's possible, but you're not going to get it through this kind of system.
That's
another
kind of
way
Gary Marcus's approach, right?
Yeah,
Gary Marcus, I like a lot. And I really recommend his.
Yeah, his writing is great. But his line is, artificial general intelligence is achievable in principle, but you're not going to get it through this. You're going to need, symbolic architectures as well.
What does that mean when you say, what is the symbolic architecture?
A symbolic architecture is one where instead of the system actually is going to compute over symbols that are syntactic entities with a semantics that's more like a language. That's more like the words of a language.
Meaning, right? Whereas LLMs, there's no meaning. There's just
rather than just kind of like statistical pattern recognition over numerically coded data. You need a symbolic structure that gives you a representation of the semantic structure of the world. That's sort of the idea behind a
meaning. It's actually meaning built in.
But really thought of in a kind of representational way, that the world has a kind of outside semantic structure, and you can encode that in a symbolic form, but you can't encode it in a numerical form, or not just in a numerical form. You need the semantic form as well. That's kind of I think where Gary Marcus is coming from. So from my perspective, like from an enactive perspective, that enactive embodied cognition and cognitive science, that's still very much bound up with this sort of representational view of how the mind is structured and related to the world.
The parachuting into.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I just want a moment on that. So, just for our readers again. So, Evan was at the forefront, one of the, originators of this idea of the enactive view of cognition, which I'm going to ask him in a second. But I just want people to understand how different, right? So when you're reading popular science articles about mind and consciousness, most of the time you're getting this kind of representational view, this sort of God's eye, looking at cognition from a sort of God's eye point of view. It's algorithms, it's representing, it's a bunch of detectors that are taking in data, and then there's a processing machine that computes. But the inactive view is something that is very different and has been gaining a lot of attention. And it's the alternative. It's a very scientific view with lots of experiments, lots of data, but it is a very different kind of view about life and mind. And so I want people to understand there's this alternative. And now I'm going to ask Evan, what is the inactive view?
Yeah, the inactive approach is an approach that really emphasizes what we were talking about earlier, which is the fundamental continuity of life and mind and the origins of mind and cognition in being embodied with this self-producing autonomous agency that comes through autopoiesis. That makes you an actor in a rich sense of agency. People sometimes talk about large language models as AI agents, but they're not agents. They don't have any autonomy. They don't really do anything other than what we build them to do, which is very constrained and limited. So in the case of life, you have a system or a being that is organized for being an active agent in the world and for creating meaning. And so the inactive view is that that's where cognition is rooted and starts. So whether we're talking about bacteria or whether we're talking about human beings, we take a perspective on cognition that emphasizes autonomous agency and action. That's the basic heart of the inactive approach. And when you look at things that way, that's very different from thinking, oh, what it is to have a mind is to have a bunch of representations in the head that correspond adequately to the way the world is, independent of you and your body and your action.
Why? Okay, so let's just stop for a second. So right, the old view is like, oh, a living system is just a bunch of sensors with a CPU, computing engine that does its best to match its behavior to the pre-existing outside world, that is being, that is information about which is being delivered by the sensors, right? So what's that? So there's some representation, some computational representation in the processing unit, your brain, right, which determines appropriate behavior given the sensory inputs. So what's different? How does that not what the inactive approach says?
So the inactive approach really emphasizes that because you have a body that has certain sensory motor capacities, you carve out a world of relevance through how you sense and how you act, and how your sensing is always determined by your acting, and how your acting is always determined by your sensing. So, in the case of, say, visual perception, you will see things differently with regard to depth, depending on your ability to move in relationship to them and your ability to act on them. This also connects to views in another research tradition called ecological psychology, which derives from the psychologist James Gibson, who emphasized that perceiving isn't something that happens in the head. Perceiving is an organism-environment relation where the organism is perceiving what affords action for the organism. So you see the chair as something you can sit on, the stairs as something you can climb up, or the color as something that indicates that the fruit is ripe and eatable. So everything in perception has to do, at this sort of basic level of perception, has to do with action possibilities. And those come from being organized in a sensory motor way. And
having a body,
having a
body.
Exactly.
And how you're in a body determines the world your body, like, it's again this idea of co-creation. It's not just a robot moving through a predetermined that's a small world. It's a body that is constantly making the world what it is, in a certain sense, through its interactions with it, and a world that is constantly making the body what it is through the interactions.
Exactly. So that's sense making. That's the sort of basic idea of sense making.
That's why I want people to understand, like, how radically different this is, and why actually this is important, right? Because we're the problem, so now we can sort of move just to the last part about thinking about, the implications of this, and the idea of planetary intelligence, which is something that, sort of I've worked on from an astrobiological perspective, but the idea that, the philosophies that got glued onto science over the last 100 years or last couple hundred years or so, and I have been fought since quantum mechanics have been kind of falling apart, is this view of like, life's just a machine, that's all it is. It's just a bunch of mechanisms. That idea is so potent that it is, it shapes the world. It shapes the world we live in. And in many ways, I think we'd all draw a link between that and the sort of environmental destruction that we've seen, and certainly climate change, where, we can't view these ideas of science flow down into everything that we do, literally into political economy. And there's probably a whole other section of this. We could invite Bentley Allen, who's a political philosopher, who has said that, he charts out what he called cosmologies, which is how different eras of science end up shaping the large scale political economic structures. But, climate change was possible because we just thought the biosphere, we can do whatever we want to it. We didn't even have the word for the biosphere, right? Life was it was a machine. It was a resource, a mountain is only its board feet of lumber. Other than that, how can you even think of it? So this inactive view sort of recognizes that there's no way to separate life from the world, right? And that it's life is not a machine. It's something very different. And so what this really requires, the inactive view, from my perspective, why I got so excited as I, read your books and learned about it, was that it's really a new view of nature. It's a different view of nature. That parachuting, that representational, computational view is one view of nature. And it sort of puts us at a distance from the world, right? The world's just out there and it's there for us to do whatever we want with. You might have to learn to obey some rules. But this is very different. It's very different. It says that there's us, that this idea of co-creation. There's no way to separate us from the world. And in science, there's no way to separate the stories we tell about the world from us. You can't take that God's eye view. And I think there's no place this is more important than in cognition, or thinking about intelligence. So let me just briefly say, I think we'll have to leave the planetary intelligence for another time. But since we only have a few more minutes, I'll just nod to it, which is to say this view of life and sense making, right? We've pointed to the fact that it goes all the way down to bacteria. So from this perspective, bacteria have intelligence, right? They're not just bumping blindly into the world.
Absolutely, yeah.
But you can go all the way up, right, to the biosphere itself. This goes back to the questions that Lynn Margulis and Lovelock raised about Gaia, about whether or not, the planet, the biosphere as a whole can be viewed as, in some agential sense, are the network of feedbacks between life, the biosphere and the other geospheres, atmosphere, cryosphere, ice, and hydrosphere, water. Are those rich enough that you do have some kind of, sense-making feedback operating on this? And this is something that, in some of my work, we called it planetary intelligence, right?
Right.
So we can, because when we get to the Earth, we can talk about that. But I just think it's interesting to sort of bracket this of the idea that intelligence or sense making and agency as the key for thinking about intelligence extends all the way down and perhaps all the way up.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the most interesting questions about, work in planetary dynamics and Earth system science, is the exact nature of the ecosphere as self-regulating, and whether that implies a kind of whole system intelligence at the planetary level. Is that the right way to describe it? There's some compelling arguments for thinking that might be the case, but obviously a lot more detailed work mapping out all the complexity of the interconnections has to be done to know whether that's going to be a fruitful kind of description.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're at 49 minutes. I think that's pretty good. Evan, let me conclude by just asking you, so what is the album I should listen to this week?
Oh, good question. So the other thing I didn't tell you about my musical history, though, is that I was like a total early music nerd when I was a teenager. So I played, recorder and go to early music, groups in the Village in New York City and play like Renaissance and Baroque music. So you should go listen to some like, maybe Baroque lute music. That's what I recommend for you now.
Oh, okay. That's not where I wanted to go.
No, I didn't think it would be.
I wanted you to recommend your favorite Talking Heads album, but no.
Yeah. Oh, well, in that case, I mean, any album is, you just pick.
I like more songs about buildings and food.
That's a great album.
I love an album.
Yeah, that's
more songs about buildings and food.
That is a great album. Yeah.
It is a great album. It is, yeah. So, all right. Anyway, on that note, I'll be listening to early lute music. And
there you go.
Report on that in 2 weeks. Okay, everybody. Well, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.